Thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm Becky Levy, the Program and Communications Director of the Haberman Institute for Jewish Studies. In just a moment, I'll turn the program over to Dr. Sandy Mendelson, one of our board members, to introduce our excellent speaker. A few reminders to get us started. We will accept questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for Dr. Wolf to take at the end of her talk. Please know that we have also enabled closed captions. If this feature is helpful to you, just click the CC button, usually at the bottom of your screen as well. Barring any technical issues, we'll post the recording of this talk on our website this week. As soon as it is live, everyone who registered will receive an email with the link and a program survey. Please take just a couple minutes to share your thoughts. Your feedback really helps us plan out our programming. I'm looking forward to learning with Dr. Wolf tonight about how gender and emotions were regarded in biblical times and how such issues resonate in our world today. I'll turn the Zoom over to Sandy now to officially begin this evening's talk. Welcome, Sandy.
Thanks, Becky. And thanks also to Fania behind the scenes. First, greetings from the Haberman Institute. The Institute is now celebrating its 40th anniversary. Our aim is to provide high-quality, in-depth encounters with Jewish thought, history, and culture. Welcome to our hundreds of Zoom participants from the Washington area and around the world. We're looking forward to this evening's program, Between Her and Others, Jealousy and Gender in Ancient Jewish Law. I would like to thank our friends Arnold and Mary Hammer for sponsoring this presentation in loving memory of Rabbi Reuven Hammer. Rabbi Hammer was a distinguished rabbi, scholar, and author in Jerusalem. We were fortunate enough that on his trips to this country, he presented many lectures for this organization and elsewhere in our community. He taught generations of conservative rabbis as the founding director of the Jewish Theological Seminary's program in Israel. We remember Reuven as our teacher and as a great friend of this organization. I'm very excited about future programs. Here are the next two coming soon. Tomorrow night, Wednesday, at 7:30 p.m. at Addis Israel Congregation, Connecticut and Porter, Washington. The Haberman Institute is partnering with Addis Israel, Eitz Chaim Congregation, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington. A very unusual in-person program, Crossroads and Connections, from the collections of the National Library of Israel. The National Library of Israel has recently embarked on a journey of renewal to make the library's resources available to audiences across the globe. As part of this initiative, and in celebration of Israel's 75th anniversary year, Dr. Raquel Euclid, head of collections at the library, will share a traveling exhibition of high-quality images from the library. Again, tomorrow, 7:30, Addis Israel. Next, in 2 weeks, Wednesday, May 17th, 7:30 p.m. online, part of our American Jewish Life series, Making It in Maine, Stories of Jewish Life in Small Town America, presented by Rabbi Dr. David Friedenreich. We invite you to learn much more about these and other programs and classes by visiting our website, habermaninstitute.org. Now for tonight's speaker. Dr. Sarah Wolf's education was at Yale, at the Jewish Theological Seminary, Hebrew University, and her PhD at Northwestern University. She now teaches at the seminary, where she is assistant professor of Talmud and Rabbinics and a research fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. She teaches, writes, and speaks about several themes in traditional Jewish sources in rabbinic texts. Think about these 5 as I read them: emotion, law, gender, community, and the imaginary. Examples I've plucked out of her online topics, and have enjoyed a few of these myself. Emotions in the Talmud. How can God prohibit an emotion? Does a legal system have an obligation to acknowledge and protect its subjects from painful emotions? The Me Too movement. Why everyone should cry in public. The limits of questioning in the Talmud. You get the idea. I find this list intriguing, a very stimulating way of combining modern interests with rabbinic sources. I turn the Zoom over to you, Dr. Wolf. Thank you so much for joining us. I know we're all looking forward to learning with you.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure and an honor to be here teaching for the Haberman Institute this evening. I will go ahead and start my presentation. So many of you have probably heard statements along the lines of the following. Women are much more empathetic than men are. Men tend to have trouble controlling their anger much more than women. Women are more sensitive than men, and they get upset more easily. Now, I want us to think about sentences like these, okay? Some of what I just said, some of the examples that I just gave, some of these are meant to be compliments, right? If I say, oh, you know, women are so empathic naturally, right? That's meant to be a good thing. If I'm saying something like, oh, men have issues with their anger, right? That's maybe more of what we would call a negative stereotype, right? Or to take a negative stereotype about women and emotions, right? The idea that women are more sensitive, right? We might think about in the Victorian era, the idea that, you know, women tended to be hysterical, which went beyond a stereotype and was really sort of a problematic idea about women's psyches and had real impact on how women were treated in that society, right? But we still have sort of statements of that sort that we make today. And I want us to think about these kinds of statements and to keep in mind, first of all, not all of them are negative, right? We make many statements about gender and emotion and the link between the two of them, right? And some of them are either neutral or positive. And I also want us to think about statements like these that posit some kind of essential link between gender and emotion as statements that are often inaccurate, but are still in some sense real. So what do I mean by that? I don't believe that it is true of every woman or every person who identifies as a woman that that person is naturally, essentially always going to be more empathetic than men, right? When we make statements like these, they are of course overgeneralizations, right? So they're not necessarily true in the sense that they don't apply to all people. They can often sort of feel like overly broad, overgeneralizations, but I want to posit that they are real. Okay, and what I mean by that is not so much that there's any kind of biological basis behind statements like these, although I'm definitely willing to acknowledge that there are differences between people's physiologies that may have some kind of an impact on their emotional life, okay? But I don't want to focus on that. What I want to focus on in terms of thinking about these kinds of connections between emotion and gender as real is the idea that when we, let's say, give men, young men, boys, the message that it's not acceptable for them to cry or be overly sensitive, let's say past a certain age, but that it is more acceptable or that it's strong in some way for them to show anger, right? We actually wind up creating a social reality that comes to align with the generalizations that we already hold about gender, right? And emotion, because what we're doing is, right, whether we realize it or not, whether consciously or unconsciously, we wind up giving people the message that if you portray emotion in a way that corresponds with our gendered expectations of what you're going to do, we're going to pay attention to you in a certain kind of way. And if you don't, we're going to give you a different type of attention, right? That maybe is actually going to implicitly, subtly, maybe not totally on the surface, right? Actually discourage you from expressing those kinds of emotions, paying attention to those kinds of emotions, right? So what I'm trying to argue is that even though it's not essentially true that every woman is more empathetic than every man. Of course, we know many, many deeply empathetic men and many women who couldn't be bothered. It is the case that when we continue to praise women for being empathetic, to tell women, oh, you're saying that because you're being empathetic, and maybe to not really acknowledge or encourage empathy quite as much in men, we wind up perpetuating a society where, in fact, that is what plays out on the ground, right? Because women are encouraged to be that way, men aren't. That's actually what we do get, right? So it is real, even though it's not true, right? Those kinds of statements actually wind up creating their own reality. Okay, so why am I talking about all this? Because what I want to do tonight is think about, right, this relationship between what we think about gender and emotion and what happens between the connection between gender and emotion, right? Think about that sort of way that gender and emotion get constructed together as it plays out in ancient Jewish legal sources. And what we're going to see is that these sources, as well as our contemporary or early modern sources that we may be more familiar with, also have their own ideas about what the connection between gender and emotion may be. And what I hope is that by exploring some of these sources, we can then think a little bit more critically, a little bit more carefully about ways in which we today may be sort of creating some narratives, some of which may be helpful, some of which maybe are not, about the relationship between emotion and gender. And what we're going to focus on in particular, as you know from the title, is going to be the emotion of jealousy. And we're going to follow how jealousy is constructed, starting with the Torah, talking about the Torah and the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, and following how ancient Jews thought about jealousy all the way through the Babylonian Talmud, hundreds of years later. And then we're going to stop there because that's the area that I focus on and I'm particularly interested in. But we'll think about how jealousy was sort of gendered in these texts and how that affects the way jealousy then becomes discussed and defined in Jewish legal contexts. Okay, so why does jealousy get defined in Jewish legal contexts? You may be thinking that I'm going to talk about one of the 10 commandments, which says don't covet. So I'll just preempt that question by saying that's actually not what I'm going to talk about. And it's actually a different word in Hebrew than the word that I am going to focus on. So we can think in our heads that, right, covet, don't covet, lo tachmod, that is actually a different word. And I'm going to sort of posit a different concept in the minds of the Bible than jealousy, in Hebrew, kina. And we're just going to focus on kina. And kina, jealousy, in fact, comes up in the context of a pretty strange and potentially disturbing, if you're not familiar with it, ritual that is portrayed in the piece of art that I have here on my title slide. So you see here, right, there's a woman in the public square. She's drinking something out of a cup. She doesn't look particularly happy about it. People are sort of looking on in dismay. So what's going on here? So what that piece of art is portraying is a ritual that the Torah describes in the book of Numbers that is supposed to be put into place in a case of jealousy. Okay, some of you may be familiar with this, many of you perhaps not, and so we're just going to spend a few minutes either reacquainting ourselves or learning for the first time, what does the Torah say is the response, the ritualized response to a case of jealousy. And what kind of jealousy are we talking about? Okay, so I brought you the beginning and the end of the passage here from Numbers, from Bamidbar, that describes exactly what this case is supposed to be. All right, and I'm just going to read a little bit of this English translation of the Torah text, okay? God spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, if any man's wife has gone astray and broken faith with him in that a man has had carnal relations with her, unbeknown to her husband, and she keeps secret the fact that she has defiled herself without being forced, and there is no witness against her, okay? So we're talking about, right, somebody's wife has committed adultery, okay? But a fit of jealousy comes over him, and he is wrought up about the wife who has defiled herself. Okay, case of adultery, and the husband is jealous. Or if a fit of jealousy comes over one and he is wrought up about his wife, although she has not defiled herself. Okay, or right, the husband is jealous, in fact, for no reason. Either way, the man shall bring his wife to the priest. So the introduction to the description of this ritual that's about to follow makes it very clear that the one and only motivating factor for this ritual is jealousy on the part of a husband about a wife. We don't know if there's a reason for the jealousy or not. Maybe she's committed adultery, maybe she hasn't, but if the man is jealous, okay, then he can bring his wife to the priest. And basically, I've left out the middle part just because it's pretty long, and the description of exactly what goes on in the ritual, though it's fascinating, is not totally germane to this talk, but essentially, she has to go through what is essentially an ordeal, a trial by kind of divine magic, where the priest, the Cohen, prepares this water for her that's been mixed up with this sort of special solution that's got God's name dissolved in it, and she has to drink it, okay, and then by drinking it, she's going to have one of two outcomes, okay, either, and this is now back to the end of the passage that I've brought for you here, right? I'm at the next ellipses. Last, he shall make the woman drink the water. Once he's made her drink the water, if she's defiled herself by breaking faith with her husband, the spell-inducing water shall enter into her to bring on bitterness, so that her belly shall distend and her thighs shall sag, and the woman shall become a curse among her people. It's not clear exactly what's going on here. Some biblical scholars think that really what's going on is that the woman who's been asked to undergo this rite is pregnant. Her husband is concerned that the baby's not his, okay, and that if, right, the Torah imagines, right, if the outcome of this ritual is that she essentially has a miscarriage, okay, that is then a sign, basically a divine sign that in fact she was guilty, right? And now here is her punishment, okay? But if the woman has not defiled herself and is pure, she shall be unharmed and able to retain seed, okay? So seemingly she stays pregnant or stays fertile, right? Whatever it is exactly that able to retain seed means here, right? She's able to sort of be spared and continue her procreative life with no consequences. And this is meant to be a divine sign that she has not done anything wrong. Okay. Not necessarily the most easy to feel excited about part of the Torah. I want to just name that. There's definitely this can be painful to read from a feminist perspective, and I do want to name that, but I think there's actually a lot of really interesting and rich stuff going on here. That has to do not just with women and suspecting women, but actually concern about men. So we'll get to that in a minute. But the text ends by saying, this is the ritual in cases of jealousy, right? When a woman goes astray while married to her husband and defiles herself, or when a fit of jealousy comes over a man and he is wrought up over his wife. So yet again, jealousy, really making clear that's what this ritual is about. Maybe she's defiled herself, maybe not, right? Either way, we're carrying out this ritual. And I didn't bring this here, but even in the middle of the ritual description, there's a special offering that's made, and it's called the offering of jealousy. Okay, that's going to come up later. So obviously, a huge piece of what this ritual is all about. And I just want to note, because I think this is really so interesting, when this ritual is discussed in rabbinic texts, which it is in detail, as we'll see, it's often referred to, pretty much always referred to, as the ritual of the suspected woman, the ritual of the sotah, the woman who's gone astray. It's never referred to as the jealousy ritual, which if you had just been reading this text, right, that's exactly what you would think it should be called, right? So the focus becomes the focus on the woman. But in fact, right, this ritual seems to be very concerned about jealousy. Why? Why take jealousy so seriously, right? To subject a woman to a public, presumably deeply degrading ritual. We know that there's no evidence against her. The text makes this extremely clear. What is such a big deal to the biblical text about jealousy that this needs to come into play? So when we think about jealousy in the context of biblical religion, I would say there's two things that most people think of. One is not coveting. We talked about that. That's not what we're going to be talking about here. The other is the idea, right? And many of you have probably heard people say this often, right, in non-Jewish contexts, is the idea of the jealous Old Testament God, right? That's kind of a trope. And in fact, the vast majority of places where the Tanakh talks about kina, our word for jealousy, do have to do with God. Often, though not always, there are explicit analogies between God's jealousy over the Jews, over the Israelites, and desire for them to be faithful and not stray or betray God. Often an explicit analogy between that relationship between God and Israel and the relationship between a husband and a wife who he suspects of cheating on him. Okay, so God's jealousy is explicitly made analogous to a husband's jealousy over his wife, just as in this context. And I would say in general, jealousy in the Tanakh is portrayed as a source that is perhaps dangerous, okay? It's strong, right? It comes with consequences. Certainly this is true in cases where God is jealous of Israel, and, you know, then there winds up being pretty major punishments. But that for the world of the biblical Jews, jealousy was also considered to be an order restoring force. This is something that some other biblical scholars, Michael Fishbane and others have written about, that jealousy is powerful, and it can hurt, but it is ultimately there to maintain the social structures, the relationships, the community organization that is supposed to be there, right? In biblical thought, the right way for the world to be is for the Jews to be loyal to God and obey the commandments and not worship other gods, right? The right way for things to be is for wives to be loyal to their husbands, right? And for husbands to know if their wife has a baby, right? To know whose baby that is and that it's theirs and that it doesn't belong to somebody else. And so, right, in the biblical mind, jealousy is a force that is powerful, that needs to be taken seriously, and interestingly, is pretty much only associated with men. Almost entirely throughout the Bible, when jealousy comes up, it's associated with men, or, right, in the case of God, right, who we can argue about to what extent God has a gender in the Bible, but certainly God is being compared, right, to the husband in this situation. So in the biblical context, right, jealousy is actually something that when a man has it is really important as a sign that something has potentially gone very wrong and that order potentially needs to be restored. Okay. And so in that world, right, the idea that there would actually be a ritual to in some way respond to, placate, deal with this excess jealousy that needs to have some kind of response, right? We can see how that might make some sense. Now, what's interesting, though perhaps not totally surprising, right, is that not long after the biblical period, actually towards the end of the biblical period, during the period of the Second Temple, we start to see that perception of jealousy change. Jealousy continues to be considered a particularly male emotion, even into the Second Temple period. But what we start to see is a major shift, and this may have to do with concurrent ideas potentially in the Greek world about what emotions are okay, what emotions are not okay, is the idea that actually jealousy is an emotion that is not just dangerous, but is problematic and doesn't need to be taken seriously and responded to so much as avoided. We see this in some ancient Greco-Roman commentaries on the Bible. Philo and Josephus, when they write about this particular passage, make it really clear that actually they're deeply uncomfortable with jealousy as the motivating factor for such a ritual to come into play. I've also brought here a verse from the Book of Ben Sira, which is a book of wisdom literature that is part of the Jewish Apocrypha, meaning it's a work that wound up not making it into the Jewish Bible, but it shares a lot in terms of genre and ideas with biblical books, and actually is interestingly part of the Catholic Old Testament, not in the Jewish Bible, but important as a reflection of what sorts of things ancient Jews were thinking. This book is written during the Second Temple period, so now we're talking about really at the end of the era during which any biblical books are being written. And Ben Sira explicitly prohibits or warns against jealousy. Okay, and jealousy in this exact context, the context of a marriage. Ben Sira says, do not be jealous for the wife of your bosom, lest you teach her to do evil against you. And by the way, just so you know, the background of this slide is in fact a real manuscript of the book of Ben Sira. It's not just a biblical looking text, it really is Ben Sira. So Ben Sira is saying, actually, jealousy is bad because jealousy is going to cause problems. Jealousy is only going to make your marriage worse. So it's the opposite of, if you're jealous, that's really important and we really need to respond to that. This is just, actually, don't be jealous in the first place. And what I want to show you for the next few minutes is that this shift in thinking of jealousy as something that is, if not valuable, at least important and potentially useful, to thinking of jealousy as actually something that is really problematic and destructive to society, is going to play out actually in the way the rabbis, the composers of early Jewish legal literature after the period of the Bible, after the destruction of the Second Temple, right, in the first few centuries CE, right, the writers of this late ancient legal literature then have to reckon with the fact that, on the one hand, they all believe that jealousy is bad. They all believe that jealousy is something that men often have, but that it's a problem and it's destructive. And yet they're inheriting this biblical text that seems to say that jealousy is not but the precondition for a major ritual that takes up at least most of one chapter of the book of Numbers. Okay, so what happens here? Okay, so this is a passage from the Mishnah, the earliest sort of law code-like Jewish text from a century and a half after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And the rabbis who wrote the Mishnah are thinking about what exactly this jealousy that sets the ordeal into motion is supposed to look like. And what they say is something that may be a little odd and surprising as an interpretation of the biblical source that we just saw. So the Mishnah says, one who jealouses his wife. Okay, and I've translated it as a weird verb that doesn't exist, and you'll just have to take my word for it that this is basically what happens in Hebrew, is that the Hebrew in the Mishnah takes the word jealousy and makes it a transitive verb. Okay, so it's hamekane et ishto, one who jealouses his wife. Rabbi Eliezer says he must jealous her before 2 witnesses. How does he jealous her? If he says to her before 2 witnesses, do not speak to so-and-so, and she speaks with him, she's still permitted to her household, but if she entered a secluded place with him and stayed there enough time to be defiled, she is forbidden to her household. Okay, so what the Mishnah says is, right, what does it mean for the husband to be jealous? In fact, it's a formal warning in front of two witnesses not to speak to a specific person. And that is what the Torah means by jealousy. And then the Mishnah adds sort of another layer. It's not enough that the husband has to make this formal warning in front of witnesses, but then, right, the wife who's been formally warned has to then go ahead and spend time in a secluded place with a specific person that her husband issued this warning about. And that is the scenario that winds up putting the whole ordeal into play. Okay, very different scenario than, right, the spirit of jealousy, right, the fit of jealousy that the Torah talked about, which seemed to be something very nebulous, internal, right, that the husband could just kind of show up and say, I have this feeling, right? Here we have something that is much more procedural. And scholars have discussed sort of why this might be, why the Mishnah goes in what seems to be really a very different direction from the Torah, okay? One theory of why the Mishnah does this is because the Mishnah is deeply uncomfortable with this whole ritual, doesn't like it, wants to protect women, and so decides to actually make the barrier to entry of doing this ritual much higher, right? So there needs to be this procedure that's much more complicated. It needs to be public from the get-go, and the jealousy has to be official and name a specific person, right? This is going to make the ritual much less likely to take place, right? So one theory is this is kind of about the Mishnah protecting women. Another theory is just that the Mishnah is a legal text, and the Mishnah likes to do things in legal ways. Nothing to do with it liking the ritual or not liking the ritual or being worried about women. The Mishnah just thinks that the way to do things right is to do them procedurally. The Mishnah makes everything has to happen in front of two witnesses because that's the way the Mishnah believes that official legal things need to happen. It's basically the Mishnah's version of getting something notarized, right? That's just how things work in the Mishnah. So that's another potential idea for why the Mishnah goes in this direction. But I want to suggest that another possible reason why the Mishnah turns jealousy, the dangerous feeling, into jealousing a formal legal procedure that has only the slimmest of things in common with jealousy, the feeling, is that the Mishnah, the authors of the Mishnah, don't like jealousy, the feeling, and they don't think that jealousy, the feeling, is good, that it should happen, that we should pay attention to it, that we should give it any kind of credibility. Rather, what they think is, right, let's turn it into something that we do find credible, right, that we do find palatable, which is some kind of formal legal mechanism. And I think we see this in another text contemporaneous with the Mishnah. This is a work of Rabbinic Midrash, Sifrei Bamidbar, Rabbinic Midrash on the book of Bamidbar, of Numbers, talking about, so I mentioned that in the Bible's description of this ordeal, there's a special sacrifice that's offered, and it's referred to as a meal offering of jealousy, okay? Again, I've only brought the English here. You'll have to just take my word for it that a very literal translation of this meal offering of jealousy would actually be a meal offering of jealousies. Okay, it's written in Hebrew in the plural, minchat knaot, okay, two jealousies. And the Midrash here in Sifrei Bamidbar picks up on that and says, two jealousies, right, knaot, just as she, the wife, causes the husband jealousy, so too she causes the lover jealousy. Just as she causes jealousy on earth, so too she causes jealousy in heaven. Okay, so here, right, in a text that is written by basically the same sort of types of people who are composing the Mishnah that we just saw, we're seeing jealousy in the context of this ritual, being understood as an emotion, but an emotion that replicates itself, right? The Midrash says the reason that the word jealousies is plural is because the jealousy reverberates. When the husband feels jealous, then, right, and the Midrash here is imagining that the woman is in fact guilty and has a lover perhaps. Well, when the husband is jealous, the lover's going to be jealous. And maybe in a world in which she's not guilty, right? She's causing jealousy on earth, or there's jealousy for her on earth, and there's going to be jealousy in heaven. There's going to be some kind of counterpart jealousy on God's part. To me, this is a portrayal of jealousy as something that is serious and that has potentially sort of hard to contain and destructive consequences. Once there's some jealousy, more people are going to feel jealousy and more people are going to feel it, right? We can, there's a contemporary idea that the mimetic theory of desire, that where desire comes from is looking at other people who desire things, and then you come to desire them, not because you genuinely have that desire, but because you see other people desiring them, and that evokes that desire in you. So, right, we could sort of say this is the sort of ancient version, the mimetic feeling of mimetic theory of jealousy, right? That when somebody has jealousy, it's actually going to evoke jealousy in others around them, or evoke jealousy in some kind of cosmic sense, right? This is not good. Right? This is not the kind of situation that we would want. And once we get to the one of the sort of later works of rabbinic literature, the Babylonian Talmud, we see actually an explicit statement that what's really going on in the Mishnah, in the rabbinic interpretation of this ritual of the suspected adulterous woman, is that according to the Mishnah, it is forbidden to be jealous. Okay? And the Talmud does this, I think, in a little bit of a subtle, kind of tricky, logical way, in exactly sort of the kind of move that the Talmud is famous for. The Talmud takes this line from the Mishnah that we just saw, one who jealouses his wife, one who performs this jealousy procedure for his wife. You know, somebody does this, and then the Mishnah goes on to say, right, then essentially the ritual is going to come into play. And the Babylonian Talmud, the Bavli, reads this as entirely being an after the fact, non-ideal situation. Meaning, if you did happen to perform the ritual, even if you did happen to perform the procedure of jealousing, even though, in fact, it's not allowed to do that, but if jealousy were to happen, then, okay, not ideal, but given that that happened, then yes, you know, the Mishnah understands then this whole right of the suspected adulteress is put into play. But the Talmud is making the claim that, according to the Mishnah, you're just not supposed to do it in the first place. And again, the Talmud describes jealousing, right, which is this technical legal formula that doesn't seem to be totally connected to the feeling, as problematic precisely because it produces jealousy, the feeling, and we don't want that. Okay, and I'm not gonna read this passage word for word, but just to paraphrase, right? The Talmud is again imagining that right, the jealousy is going to reverberate in one of two ways, right? One possibility is the husband does the official jealousing, which again is telling the woman not to speak to a specific man. And the Talmud's imagining that as a result of this, the woman's gonna kind of stay home and stop talking to people who she was used to talking to. And those people are going to then feel jealousy and say, why is she ignoring us, right? And they're going to come to have jealousy regarding her. They didn't in the first place, but now as a result of the formal procedure, they do. And another idea that's set forth, which is maybe even more interesting, is that actually, if a husband does this formal jealousing legal warning procedure to his wife, that's actually going to produce jealousy within the marriage. But even if he didn't have the feeling of jealousy in the first place, once he performs this official warning, he is then going to be on his guard in a way that he never was before. Is she going to take me seriously? Is she now going to go talk to this person? Oh my goodness, what if something is really wrong, right? And again, the Talmud sees this as a problem, as something that we don't want to happen, as something that we don't want to let get out of control, right? Specifically regarding men. Therefore, he holds that it is forbidden to perform jealousing. Now, what I think is really interesting and useful about reading the text this way is that, again, right, as I mentioned, often these texts are considered in terms of what they have to say about women. Are they misogynist? Are they actually trying to protect women in some way by limiting the cases in which this right can be performed? Are they concerned about women as people or merely as part of the family structure? And what I really want to emphasize here is that I actually think the texts are just as much concerned with men and men's role in the family structure as that can be played out dangerously when jealousy comes into play, just as much as the texts are concerned about women. And one thing that is really fascinating about the way the Talmud comes to think about gender and emotion, and again, I'm not trying to make a claim here that the rabbis are or aren't feminist, right? This is just kind of an interesting sort of thing to note about what's important to them and what they see and maybe are creating as real in terms of the link between gender and emotion, is that they seem very concerned in general that men are going to have emotions like jealousy that are powerful, dangerous, destructive, and need to be kept in check. And even more interestingly, on the converse, Talmudic stories often portray women as figures who are a source of clear-headedness, emotional calm, able to calm down the men in their lives who are upset, right? And potentially prevent those men's emotions from causing destruction in the world. And I just want to bring you one more text that I think is a really interesting example of this. And then I think we'll wrap up and open things up for Q&A. So our last text, also from the Babylonian Talmud, is a often ignored ending to a somewhat famous to the extent that anything in the Talmud can be considered famous. Okay, so famous in a very, very niche sense, story from the Talmud. And this is a story known as the Oven of Achnai, Tanaro Shel Achnai, basically in which the rabbis are arguing about whether a particular oven is pure or impure. And there's one rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer, who takes a specific position and keeps trying to back up his position by divine fiat. So he says, if I'm right, may the carob tree outside uproot itself and go somewhere else. May the walls of the study hall collapse inwards. And every time he says this, that happens. A voice from heaven comes and rules in his favor. And nonetheless, the rabbis wind up deciding that's nice, but in fact, we go by the majority. So, you know, he's outvoted and we don't make legal decisions based on divine voices from heaven. God, again, famously, using scare quotes here, laughs and says, my children have defeated me. And that's often where people end the story when they tell it. It's kind of a funny punchline. I've actually heard it told to me as a joke by someone who didn't know that it came from the Talmud and just thought that this was like a pretty good Jewish joke, that, you know, the rabbis are arguing and one rabbi has God on their side and the rest of the rabbis say, oh, majority rules. It is kind of funny. But the continuation of the story is actually quite sad. Rabbi Eliezer is banned, and he is incredibly hurt that he's been sent away and excommunicated and kind of cast out of the community because he wanted to rule not following sort of standard rabbinic procedure. He's absolutely miserable. He's crying. His eyes are streaming with tears. Okay, this is where our text here now is picking up. He takes off his shoes and he sits on the ground. Clearly, he's having a terrible time, very, very depressed. And as a result of Rabbi Eliezer crying hysterically, there's a famine. The world was smitten in 1/3 of the wheat, 1/3 of the olives, and 1/3 of the barley. It was taught the destruction was so great on that day that every place where Eliezer cast his eyes immediately was burned. Okay, so not jealousy, but again, very, very powerful male emotion that is causing literal physical destruction to the world. So Rabban Gamliel at this time is on a ship. He's a leader in the rabbinic community. He's sort of the head of the group of rabbis who has caused this emotional harm to Rabbi Eliezer. He's on a ship, and a wave of the sea is about to drown him. Okay, and he says, it seems to me that this is because of Rabbi Eliezer, the son of Hyrcanus. He says, I think that actually the sea is responding in some kind of cosmic way to the emotions that my rabbinic colleague is expressing. And he needs to basically get up and appeal to God and say, I really didn't, mean to do this in order to shame anybody or for my own honor, right? But I just was trying to sort of do what I thought was best for the rabbinic community and to limit disagreements. And that's the only way to get the sea to quiet down. And the story ends, why have I brought you this? The story ends with a woman whose job it is to keep the peace here. And she's interestingly sort of implicated in both of these men's lives. She's the sister of Rabban Gamliel, and she's the wife of Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, and after this event, when her brother, Rabban Gamliel, almost drowns, she tells Rabbi Eliezer that he can no longer pray supplicatory prayers. He can't pray Tachanun anymore, okay? He can't pray in a way that shows how upset he is. Why not? Because she's concerned that his prayers, that his upset is going to cause physical harm to her brother. One day, she's distracted. She's giving charity to somebody at the door. She turns around. She finds that Eliezer has fallen on his face. And she says to him, stand up, you've killed my brother. Meanwhile, the shofar blast went out from the house of Rabban Gamliel, signaling that he had died, right? So the minute she turns her face, Rabbi Eliezer kind of lets his grief go. And this, again, in some kind of cosmic way, causes Rabban Gamliel's death, and seemingly the only person who knew enough to try to get Rabbi Eliezer to stop expressing his emotions in this powerful, dangerous way, right, is Ima Shalom, the one woman who comes up in this story. It's a tragic ending. Definitely understandable why people who like the beginning part of this story don't necessarily focus on this part. But it's, I think, a really fascinating example here of tropes about gender and emotion that we see actually often in rabbinic literature. These are, I think, in some ways really different ideas about how men behave emotionally and how women behave emotionally than we do today. I think that the sort of stereotype today is not that men are overly emotional and that women are sort of the calm and rational ones usually, although maybe in some ways it is, right? When we think about actually, right, ideas that it's men who use their emotions to harm, right? And then it's women who use their emotions to heal. Again, I'm not giving any of these tropes as examples because I think they're true. But I think that they are real. They do create reality, right? As we've seen in these texts, they help create the rabbi's legal reality. They inform, right, what the rabbis think about. I will just say, and we can talk more about this in the Q&A, by legal reality, I don't even mean real reality, because actually the rabbis themselves in the Mishnah acknowledge that they don't actually perform the Sota ritual, the ritual of the suspected adulterous woman. This is not part of rabbinic legal practice on the ground, but it's part of the reality of rabbinic legal thought, the rabbinic legal mind, for a legal practice that doesn't actually take effect in any real way. There's pages and pages of rabbinic legal thought that's devoted to it. And so, right, these tropes wind up with a really strong sort of afterlife. And I hope that this can help us think about, first of all, just how totally historically contingent our ideas about gender and emotion are, that they really change from culture to culture in many ways, and that they are something that we sort of as societies can create, but also can decide to reimagine. And so, right, what is the reality of our social world now, and what is the reality that we would like to see? And in what way might we find the Talmud and other rabbinic literature's treatment of gender and emotion to be helpful, right? This is something that I find fascinating about these texts. Sandy mentioned that I've done a little bit of writing about the Me Too movement, right? There's, I think, something potentially compelling about the idea of Jewish texts that acknowledge the capacity for people's emotions, and often men's emotions, in romantic partnership settings to become dangerous and to become out of control, right? And the idea that we need to respond to that. I don't think in literally the ways that the rabbis imagine, right? But I think we can really relate in certain ways to that impulse and ask ourselves, right, what would a world look like today that really took men's emotions seriously, and figured out, right, not just how to, contain them or tell people not to feel them, but to really think about people's emotions of all genders, and their consequences, and what it means to build a society that doesn't let them get out of control. Okay, I'll stop there. I would love to open things up now for Q&A. I'll stop my screen share, and I'm just gonna be looking at the Q&A tabs. So feel free to type more questions if you have any in the little Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Okay. So great. I got an example of from Exodus about not worshiping other gods, and other examples from the Bible of God being a jealous God. Great. Appreciate that. All righty. Okay. Julian says it might just be that in that society that a jealous husband would divorce his wife and she would be cast out destitute with child, shunned by society, and she and the child might die out of poverty and social shame. But the ritual allows a way for the mother either to be accepted back or to lose the child, albeit one that is still cruel in different ways to both mother and child, but it might be the lesser of two evils in that society. Okay, great, Julian. I love this. I think this is a really compelling charitable read of the biblical ritual, right? That we can imagine, right? And this is true of a lot of biblical rituals or legal texts that seem to be disturbing to us in our modern context, right? But are actually considered to be quite lenient today, right? Probably one of the more famous ones being the idea of an eye for an eye, right? Lex talionis, which even the rabbis considered to be quite barbaric, that if somebody pokes out somebody's eye, that the perpetrator should have their own eye poked out. But scholars know that in the context of the Bible, in fact, this is sort of an improvement compared to other ancient Near Eastern law codes that might say that you could kill someone for poking somebody else's eye out, right? So there's actually more of a little bit of a sense of fairness. Okay, on a totally separate note, right? Julian's imagining that perhaps, right, the Sotah ritual is a way of making sure that there is some kind of recourse such that women can't sort of be divorced willy-nilly. Lots of sort of debates in the ancient world about to what extent divorce should be allowed or not, exactly for this reason, right? Because of the idea that a divorced woman is considered to be quite vulnerable. Yeah, so no, I think that's absolutely possible. Right. And again, I think what's interesting about that is we can think about it as what's really going on here is that women deserve to be protected. And we can also think about it, and I do think that the rabbinic texts really pick up on this as a concern about what can happen if jealousy is left unchecked, right? And a sense that needs to be responded to in a particular way. Okay. Seeing more questions. All right. John Dine asks, do you think there is a contextual reason for the difference in jealousy between Tanakh and Second Temple / rabbinic literature like Greek philosophy or other larger historical currents? Yeah, I do think we certainly see in Stoicism, for example, the idea that jealousy is considered to be a negative emotion. Like we do see this in the larger Greek world. It's often difficult for scholars to figure out direct influence versus sort of larger cultural trends. So where exactly this comes from, whether it's from Greek philosophy or there's kind of, a broader cross-cultural shift here, I don't know, but yes, there is definitely, this is happening within a cultural context that is sharing that increased sort of wariness of jealousy for sure. Thank you for that excellent question. Okay. Somebody else asks, it seems that the definition of jealousy is not clear. And in the various examples, you gave different emotions, things we would consider anger or hurt or rivalry. Interesting. We're all defined as jealousy. Yeah. So the word kina can mean sort of a spectrum of what we would probably consider to be somewhere between anger and jealousy. It can mean all those things. And in fact, sometimes kina is defined not as jealousy, but as zeal. These words, so in the Greek word for kina is zdelosis. So you've actually got that Z sound that winds up in the word zeal. So not really clear that people in late antiquity totally distinguished between those emotions, right? And so we have to remember, like, our emotional categories just aren't necessarily going to be identical to the emotion categories that people in antiquity had, or they don't necessarily map on one-to-one. But it is true that that sometimes this word kina really can mean something much more, and someone, maybe the same person, asked, aren't there also examples of jealousy that aren't due to marital relationships in the Bible? Absolutely. Examples like Cain and Abel, the word jealousy doesn't come up. Okay, the word kina doesn't appear there, which is interesting. But there certainly are places that the word kina appears that have nothing to do with marital relationships whatsoever, but actually have to do much more with the sense that I was talking about earlier, of some kind of using force to restore some sense of order in the world, right? And if you think about the word zealot, okay, which comes from, right, this same kind of root, right? That's somebody who, right, is not experiencing jealousy in any kind of like relational context at all, but is really interested in restoring some sense of order. And I guess what I would say is, I think that even marital jealousy is rooted in a similar kind of belief, whether conscious or not, that there is a proper order, which is that parties within a marriage ought to be faithful to each other, and that jealousy is a response to the threat from the outside to that order, just like zealousness is a response to the threat from the outside, say, to God's law or God's order, right? So this is sort of a particular form, you might say, of zeal, jealousy, right? It's just zeal that is playing out within the context of the family structure, right? In the biblical text. Okay. I will take some more questions. Deb Schuback asks, I've heard that the woman would never have a problem drinking the waters and that the beginning acts were just to get her to plead to any guilt. It's interesting. There's no point. So there's no point in the ritual there where there's sort of space made for her to speak, to make any kind of claim for herself about whether she's done anything or not. I've actually heard often sort of the reverse of that, which is the woman would never have a problem drinking the waters, meaning that actually it's very unlikely that anything bad would happen to the woman in real life from drinking like a magic potion, essentially, and that the people who came up with this ritual actually knew that. And in fact, the desire was really just to clear women's names, right? I've heard that interpretation, right? That, that essentially, right, it's basically saying, oh, here, drink this like mud soup. And if something bad happens to you, right, but the likelihood that something bad would actually happen, right, she's just basically drinking water with ashes in it, right, is pretty slim. And so really it's a ritual made to like make the man feel better, but also get the woman off the hook. I definitely see where people get that reading from. Again, even if that is the case, it's still interesting, right, that it's all of this work done in order ultimately to appease the man's jealousy. Okay, in other cultures, it is usually the woman who wreaks havoc by being jealous, says a question asker. Why do you think this emotion was placed on women when it became negative? There's definitely, yes, and there's actually a writer, a contemporary writer about affect and emotion named Sian Nyai, who wrote a book called Ugly Feelings, I think about 15 or 20 years ago, about sort of not often paid attention to, sort of overlooked emotions, many of which she sees as associated with women, often in negative ways. And envy, she uses the word envy and not jealousy, but it's exactly one of the emotions that she talks about as being associated with women. The reason that she brings up, and this she takes actually, I think, from psychoanalytic theory for why that's true, is that envy has to do with a sense of lack in oneself, as well as a sense of aggression towards somebody else who has the thing that the person lacks. And because women in, sort of patriarchal societies wind up more often being lacking parties, and because aggression in women is often viewed as dangerous, envy then becomes viewed as a negative emotion that reveals something ugly about the woman who feels it, as opposed to maybe being an actually justified response to the society that woman lives in. That is one answer that I think is really compelling. It's not a question that I personally have worked on, but I think that's one potentially really interesting response. Okay. Thanks for all of these fascinating questions. Okay, somebody sharing something really powerful and really sad. Catherine Mulhern notes that she worked in a battered women's shelter, and it seemed that male jealousy drove them to abuse women, children, and pets. So that understanding might be in the background of rabbinical protective stance towards women. Yeah, totally possible. Totally possible, and I appreciate you sharing that. Alrighty, and maybe I'll just take one or two more. Okay.
Dr. Wolf, we had a question come in separately asking what drew you to this kind of research, and what are your plans moving forward? What are you looking forward to researching, either in more detail or more broadly?
Thanks. I really appreciate that question. I have two answers to the question of what drew me to this research. One is the sort of flip / Freudian answer, which is my mother is a therapist. But the other answer that's more serious and maybe slightly more boring is I was actually reviewing a book by a colleague of mine named Ayelet Libson about subjectivity in the Talmud, where she mentions kind of off the cuff that despair over lost objects is something that the Talmud pays special attention to, and she sees this as a sign that the Talmud really cares more about people's subjective experience than other works of rabbinic literature. And I read this and I thought, wait a second, the Talmud talks about something called despair over lost objects, but despair over lost objects doesn't actually mean anything having to do with people's real emotions. It's a legal fiction that the Talmud basically made up in order to have an easier time talking about which objects have owners and which objects don't. But it's totally a legal construct. It's not an emotion at all. And then I started thinking, well, what if it's both? And what if when we think about the Talmud, I think often as so concerned with legal realities and resolving logical issues, what if at the same time the Talmud really is trying to do a dive in kind of a philosophical sense almost into how humans work? Right? And what people are likely to think and feel in different scenarios. And is that really also part of what's going on in the Talmud's discussion of ownership? And I realized that actually the connection between emotion and law comes up in lots of different contexts in the Talmud. So this is now answering the second part of your question, Becky, where I'm going with this. So I'm working on a book on emotions in rabbinic law. So looking at despair over lost objects as one, jealousy as another, shame has a really clear role in ancient Jewish and actually also Roman law in that you can sue for shame. And I think the discussion there of who feels shame, what counts as shame, to what extent shame is personal versus social, is also just a really interesting lens into how the rabbis think about emotions and how they work, in addition to what they think sort of law is and should be for. And right now I'm starting to do some work on mourning rituals and the connection between sort of what we think of as spontaneous expressions of grief and what is presented as legally mandatory rituals, and how and if those things can coexist at the same time. So that's a little bit about where my work is right now. I have an article about shame and the connection between shame and sight in rabbinic literature that just came out on an online journal. If you Google my name and shame, I'm sure you'll find it. And this work is actually going to be forthcoming as a chapter in a volume honoring my colleague at the seminary, Richard Kalman.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay. I don't know if you have any last words you'd like to leave us with, some questions we can ponder on our own, or anything you'd like to underline as we close out the session together tonight. And then I'll leave you to say goodnight to our community. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. I'll just close by reiterating that I think that emotions can just be a really helpful lens, and this idea that emotions are constructed by societies like the biblical world, like the rabbinic community and the texts that they produce, just as much as they are being responded to. That this is an important way to read and think about their sources, and it's an important way to think about our own lives as well, and potentially to help us remember that we have maybe some agency about the emotional communities that we live in and create. Okay, thanks so much. Thanks for learning with me, and wishing everybody a good night.